Hello, dear viewers. Support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it. And also, make sure you comment your thoughts. Now let's start the video. Willis. One of the first things that he had done after Father had died was to have the message network redirected to the High Tower. There had long been a system of messaging from the coast of the Reach to Highgarden, the High Tower and the Arbor against Ironborn raiding. Now it was informing of the progress of just one ship. "Lord Stark will be here in a few days," he muttered and dropped the message onto the table by the window. There was a breeze coming through the window that made it quiver a little, and he placed a paperweight over it to prevent it from flying through the air and out of the doorway. "Good," said Grandfather, and he looked at him worriedly. There was something slightly off about him these past few days, as if he was coming to terms with something. Perhaps they all were. The blight was still out there, still spreading out from Old Town like a slow pestilence, and the weight of worry on him was ever present. Aunt Melora also worried him. She had always been high-strung, flighty even, fascinated by books of magic, or so he had been led to understand. Now she was a hollow-eyed wraith at the table, looking downcast and depressed as she leafed through a book about the High Tower. He had heard that she had had a tremendous argument with Grandfather, with repeated shrieks of, "Why?" But no one knew what that argument had been about. "I've doubled the guards," Grandfather said eventually. "Ned Stark must get here safely. Old Town is abuzz with rumors about all kinds of things, and I've had to stop people from suggesting the maddest of ways of dealing with the gate. Gods, our bloody ancestors." Willis raised an eyebrow at that, and Lord Hightower made a noise deep in his throat that was almost a snarl. "Guard the gate," we were told, and we have. But so much has been lost. So much forgotten. We forgot what was behind it. Past Hightowers built the High Tower stage by stage, and we even used Bran the Builder to build it higher. But at some point we forgot, or allowed Andal-like thinking to influence us. Andal-like thinking? Willis looked at Grandfather, confused. Grandfather sighed and passed a hand over his lower forehead, as if wiping his anger away. The First Men knew that the threat of the others had never gone away, not truly, and they knew that the drowned god's prison, or what amounted to it, had to be guarded. They were familiar with magic in root and stone, which waxes and wanes, like the moon. They thought differently, I think. They did not forget things. And then the Annals came, with their gods and their fears of other gods, and their gods' damned religious fervor that meant that things they did not understand had to be destroyed. They burned the Weir Woods, slaughtered the children of the forest, killed those who dared to disagree, and the High Towers of the time did not do enough to stop them. The children helped to create the gate, and where are the children now that we need them in our hour of need? Dead. Gone. Grandfather was roaring now, red-faced and furious. How much could we have remembered if they had still been out there, waiting in their godswoods, ready to give advice, able to warn us? Grandfather gestured at Otherbane. "The First Men made that with the help of the children of the forest. You are still finding out what it can do. We know." "Father," Melora said the word in a dead flat voice, almost a voice of warning. It was a word that finally made the blood drain from Grandfather's face. He clenched his fists for a long moment and then leant against the window with a sigh. "Baelor will do what he can to quiet the city. Gods, I wish we still had vigilance." "Willis, we have found a treatise on Otherbane. It is in the language of the First Men, and it is obscure even then. You must study it. After all, you were born to wield it." He looked at Grandfather, and unease rippled through his skin for a moment. "Where is it?" "Here." Aunt Melora held a slim book out, and he shuddered slightly at the look in her eyes. There was a combination of emotions there that puzzled him. Was it outrage, anger, some form of grief, or was it pure and simple madness? He took it and opened it, frowning down at the runes. Yes, this was obscure indeed. He would have to study this carefully. "There is something else," Grandfather said in a voice that made him look at him at once with alarm. "You should tell me at once if your dreams darken. There might be a reason for that." He frowned at that. "The tale from Winterfell about the mountain, about his possession. You think that I am in danger of that?" Oddly enough, Grandfather looked at Melora rather than him, a long glance filled with twitches of the eyebrow on both of their parts before Grandfather sighed a little. "Not quite. It's hard to explain. I fear that something dark is coming, something that is racing Ned Stark. What it is uncertain. There are many interpretations. Gods. It's hard to even explain it. Triple the guards, Aunt Melora said the words in that same dead, flat voice, almost in resignation. We must be sure on this. Sure on what? Wellis asked the question with narrowed eyes. They were not telling him something. But what? The avalanche is on us. The stones can no longer vote, Grandfather said, sounding as if he was quoting someone. And then he looked up. The moment that Ned Stark gets here, we escort him to the gate. Do you understand? After a long moment, he nodded. I do. Grandfather's eyes seemed to search his face for a long moment. Good, he said eventually. I'm proud of you, my boy. So proud of you. Rosie Watsley, the best way to deal with the god's awful stench in the alcove of the passageway was to breath through the mouth and not through the nose, and concentrate on anything that was not related to the smell, like the rope that was hanging from the trestle over the opening, the way that the shadows inside the shaft that went downwards moved as the lantern was used to inspect the grisly bottom of said shaft, and the hatch that normally kept the alcove safe and the stench down, because it looked old but very well made. After a while, the light started to come up as the man in the shaft climbed out of it, one-handed, using his feet as well on the knotted rope. As he reached the top, he placed the lantern by the side and levered himself up and out, before wiping his forehead. Gods, said Patty Waters in a tired and horrified voice. It's worse than we thought, my lord. The short servant had been acting as his permanent man in the Red Keep for some years, being very quiet and very observant. Rosalie wordlessly handed over a skin of watered wine and allowed Patty the time to take a large swallow of it and then visibly compose himself. Worse? There must be 20 to 30 of them down there, my lord. From the clothing they were servants and a few guards. Lancer guards, I might add, based on the cloaks and the armor. The oldest ones are, well, there's a lot of muck and filth and bones. And the newest? There were two I recognized, my lord, barely. One was a serving girl. Ella, by name. Sweet young thing, very bad at knocking on doors before opening them. I fear that's why she's down there with her throat cut, I think. There's a guard next to her. Timon. She vanished 10 days before His Grace took the royal family north to Winterfell, and he disappeared 2 days after that. He shook his head. Timon, I remember him being smug about something before he vanished. Smug for a month or two, I think. She used him to kill, and he must have thought he'd be rewarded, Rizzoli surmised. How did he die? Head's bashed in, and there's a blood stain on the wall of the shaft. I think he was hit, fell, killed in the fall when he hit stone. Going down, my lord. Rensselaer! The call was from far away down the passageway, and Rensselaer turned his head. Down here? Then he stood and helped to stand. All right, get that rope up and move that trestle. We need to get that hatch closed before the stink spreads further. Aye, my lord. As Patty got to it, Rensselaer stepped out into the passageway, taking a gulp of watered wine himself, and then peered to see who was approaching. After a moment, he blinked in surprise at the approaching shape of a tall old man with silver hair. Uncle Alden. Lord Alden Estermond had seen close to 70 years come and go, but he was still quite hale and hearty, right up until the moment he smelled the stench and stopped dead in his tracks, one hand going over his nose. Gods, Rensselaer, what is that stink? My unbeloved former good sister's work, Rensselaer said bitterly as he gestured into the alcove, where Peta was now closing the hatch with some relief. His uncle joined him to watch. It's a former privy, blocked off now and unused since the Dance of Dragons. If I have it right, I don't understand. The Kingslayer's full confession finally came in from Winterfell. He mentioned that Cersei would have those servants who walked in on their cavorting dealt with. I found myself wondering how they were dealt with. He pointed down to the end side of the passageway. There's a set of stairs there that go up to a good thick door that comes out near her old quarters. Unused since before Summerhall, I think, until Cersei discovered it. There's footprints in the dust, drag marks too. By all the gods, how many? Partay. The servant bobbed his head at Uncle Alden. At least 20, my lord. Perhaps 30. Hard to tell, as it's pretty bad at the bottom. Uncle Alden pulled a face. The murderous whore. She always thought herself more important than anyone else, Rizzoli replied, looking at the hatch. Well now, Partay. My lord? Hire 10 men in the city. Warn them ahead that this is a horrible, messy job, but tell them that it's worth a dragon each if they complete the job of emptying the shaft of bodies. They can work in shifts of 2 to spread the load. Get them to at least try and identify the bodies. Alert the Silent Sisters, too. I want the bodies treated with respect. However they died, they didn't deserve this. Tell the men that we'll replace any clothing that get ruined by what's at the bottom of that shaft, and that we'll provide washing facilities and food. I want it done, and I want it done right. Understand? Tate nodded and bowed before striding off. How did no one smell this place? Uncle Eldon said in horrified amazement. The hatch is a snug fit, and this section is unused, Aurelia replied tiredly. And what's one more stench in a city of them? Now, Uncle Eldon, you don't often leave Greenstone. What's amiss? The old man directed a long and very level look at him, making his heart sink a little. Really, we need to talk somewhere private, where I cannot be overheard. He took Uncle Eldon to one of the rooms that he'd identified as not being filled with odd alcoves or strange holes in the ceiling where someone could eavesdrop on whoever was inside. Even then, he still looked about carefully. Varys was still Varys. Uncle Eldon watched him with a little bemusement that ebbed after he quietly told him why he was checking. After Rainsley was finished checking the room, he raised an eyebrow at his uncle, who sighed and ran a hand over his forehead for a moment before looking his nephew in the eye. Rainsley, you need to marry, and marry quickly. He didn't groan, as this was something that he had been expecting. I know, Uncle, he said after a moment. John Aaron has also talked to me, and I know that I must marry. I have been talking to prospective matches for the past few months. Months? Are you close to a choice? No, he was not. Although he had been hawking with Lord Kellington and his daughter Bethany, and he found her pleasant to talk to and remarkably proficient with the bow for a woman. But he had not taken things any further as he thought he had to search more. He had to admit now that he had been procrastinating. Not yet, he admitted. Perhaps soon. Uncle Eldon scowled. Choose quickly. Whitter, better, get a child in her. He stared at his uncle. Why the rush, Uncle Eldon? Boy, you should have a wife already at your age. A gnarled fist hit the table next to him, and then he sighed. Rensley, your Stormlords are, I will not say restless. I will simply say that they are talking. Talking of what? Many things. Legends. The long night. Robert finding the Durandon tombs and Stormbreaker. They talk a lot about that. I know, you were there for that as well. But they talk of Robert, not you. There's talk of things waking up. Old things, old traditions. The call is not questioned in the Stormlands. Not with those cages going around with bits of whites in them. Your Stormlords know that we are about to fight a terrible war on the Wall. They know that after so many years of summer, an equally long winter is to come. Uncle Eldon sighed. My sons are getting Greenstone ready, and Estermont as a whole, and there is a lot of talk in the Stormlands about succession. Most houses are being sensible and settling disputes. A few are being idiots. I heard about Piglot trying to get one over Kellington and failing. But most are trying to settle their differences, and there are marriage alliances being forged all over the place. There is talk of heirs and spares, and you have no heir. There is no child in Storm's End, and there needs to be. You need a canny wife to run Storm's End, and a child at her breast. People are talking. He nodded tiredly. I will make a decision soon, Uncle. But Uncle Eldon did not seem satisfied. Rensley, I must be blunt. People are talking about many things. Some say that they wish that Robert was still at Storm's End, as he has done so much. Others that they wish that Stannis was there, as he held it against all odds. I know, this is unfair. You have not had a chance yet to be tested in war. But you are very much in Robert's shadow, and this Stormbreaker has gotten so many people talking. That stung more than a bit, but he was man enough to realize that was not the fault of his brothers. I understand. Then he saw the look on the face of his uncle. What else? There is talk, whispers in the wind for the most part. But as I am your uncle, there are times when people see me approach and change the subject abruptly. Which makes me wonder of a loyal petition to the king to have one of his legitimized bastards, namely Edric, made your heir until you can produce one of your own. Bewilderment turned rapidly to rage, and he bounded to his feet in a trice. What? No! How dare they? That would be without precedent. That is an insult. Who says that, Uncle Eldon? Whose face was flushed, and he could feel the famous Baratheon rage starting to overwhelm him. How dare they, indeed. I will not tell you, as I would not condemn a man for a rumor of a whisper. Uncle Eldon snapped back at him coldly. Sit down, boy, and think. Trembling with rage, Renly sat down after a long moment, still ready to flip the table over and break a chair against the nearest wall. They dare, Renly, because some doubt if you can produce an heir at all. There is talk of you and Loras Tyrell. You might have thought you were being discreet when you were with him. You were not. People are talking, just rumors at the moment, but those rumors are spreading, and I must be blunt here. You are my nephew, and I love you dearly, but you are also my Lord Paramount, and I must provide you with the best counsel that I can give. People are wondering if, in this time, with a war against the others coming on the wall, with a second long night coming, if a sword-swallowing pillow-biter can lead the Stormlands. The rage vanished in the blink of an eye as the shock overtook him. Who knew? When had someone seen them? Heard them? What should he do? What could he do now? Your silence says volumes, Uncle Eldon said eventually in a tired voice. So it is true then. He struggled to speak for a long moment. Uncle, Save your words, you must act now. With every day that passes without you acting that loyal petition, idea will gain strength. Put aside your position here, and go home. Marry quickly. She must be a Stormlander, and the marriage must be at Storm's End. There must be a bedding, and after it you must stay in her bed enough to father the first of many children. Uncle Eldon looked at him with understanding and sympathy in his eyes. If you can father a bastard or two here and there, even better. Yes, boy, it's a mummer's farce. But it will secure the loyalty of the Stormlands in the greatest storm that it has faced in thousands of years. You must be a leader now. The leader that the Stormlands needs. Put your needs aside and listen to the voice of duty. You cannot be selfish anymore. You are a Baratheon of Storm's End, and you need an heir born from your balls. And Loras Tyrell must never be seen with you again. Afterwards, he could not say when it was that Uncle Eldon left the room. Was it a moment or an hour? All he knew was that he sat there in that room, staring at the wall opposite him, thinking about so many things. And then, after that undefined period, he stood and strode out of the room and back to his own quarters. Once he was there, he closed the door and sat at his desk for a long moment, before looking at the nearby fireplace. It had the materials for a fire next to it, and he knelt by it and recalled his lessons, before starting to lay the kindling at the bottom, and then the larger pieces of wood, and then a few others. A splash of lamp oil and a stub of lighted candle got the fire started. Only then did he sit down at his desk and pull out a pair of intricate keys. The first unlocked a secret compartment of his desk, which slid out to reveal a slim box. The second unlocked the box, which opened to reveal the letters inside. They were letters that he could not bring himself to destroy. Letters that Loras had sent him through various confidential ways, letters of intimacy, of treasured words, of love. He fingered them in silence, unable to open any of them and reread the words on the pages. After a while, he willed his hands to stop their shaking and picked the letters up, before standing and taking them to the fire, where he paused for a long moment, and then he thrust them into the flames. As the paper caught and crackled and burned, he wiped the tears from his cheeks and then closed his eyes for a long and anguished moment. When he opened them again, he could see the ashes dancing at the grate, almost mocking him. And then, finally, he undid the chain at the back of his neck and let the signet ring with the worn crest tumble into his hand. It had been Father's ring. One of his very few memory of his father had been him handing his old signet ring to him for protection, before he and Mother had left for their fruitless mission to Essos to find a bride for Rhaegar. He had another one, of course, the one that Robert had made after their parents had died in Shipbreaker Bay because Father's had not fit his huge fingers, but that had never really fit Renly's fingers. The old one did. Now, he looked at it for a long moment, and then he went back to his desk. He needed to meet Bethany Kellington again. He did not know what was there between them, but he would make it work. The Stormlands needed an heir. Yaxlu. By the time the king finally fell silent and leant back in his chair, Stormbreaker propped against the table to one side. Aemon had closed his eyes and then placed a trembling hand over them. Robert Baratheon's tale of what he had seen, thanks to the Green Man at the Ruby Ford so many years ago, had obviously deeply affected him. Aemon, I don't know what to say, the king said eventually. I have hated Robb Targaryen for so long for what he and his father did, that now, knowing that it was only talking to me that drove him to his death, I have no words. What can I say? It sounds like madness. He thought back to Egg so many years ago, and his letters bemoaning his elevation to the Iron Throne, as well as his own sorrows from the news of the rebellion. You have closed a circle you were not aware of, Your Grace, he said sorrowfully. You have done what you had to, what, perhaps, you were born to. The gods can be cruel at times, and merciful as well. Radgar, he thought he had interpreted prophecy correctly. When he had not, these things are difficult to interpret, hard to understand. You did the right thing. As he opened his eyes again, he could see that the king was staring at the fire. After a long moment, the younger man smiled a bitter smile. I never thought that I'd ever say that I felt sorry for Rhaegar Targaryen, and I could not tell him what else lay ahead. That letter from his daughter, that poor little scrap. She wrote to him of her cat, and I killed him before she was murdered by Tywin Lannister's men. She didn't deserve that. You did what had to be done, he replied tiredly, and you could not have known what Tywin Lannister intended. Revenge for him is something personal and wide. There was a silence in the room for a long moment before the king nodded. Aye, you have that right. He rubbed at his forehead for a moment and then swept that large hand across his face and sighed. Lyanna told me in Winterfell that I had to set things aside to become the Storm King, her shade, her ghost. Call it what you will. Gods, whoever would have thought I'd be saying such things and not being taken for a madman? Aemon shook his head a little. There are forces at work here that we cannot fathom. Not yet. Who knows what our ancestor Daenerys, the dreamer, foresaw? 2 lines were combined within your blood, Durrand and Baratheon, reinforced with more Targaryen. The Durrandon line seems to be coming to the fore. But do not forget that you too are descended from Daenerys. Who knows what the blending has created? You will be a Storm King alike, and yet unlike your ancestors of Storm's End, you must not hold back. Embrace what you feel. Lead us. There was a long moment of silence, and then Robert Baratheon, the king, nodded slowly. You speak wisely, great uncle. I'll think on what you said. I have to. Another silence, and then, Gods, I should have talked to you before. Asked you south or come to the north myself. Foolish of me not to, my bloody pride. You are angry, he replied with a sigh. And anger can fester at times, deepen, become poisonous, and you were married then to a woman whose father takes grudges rather seriously. The king laughed softly at his words. That's putting it lightly. Castamere. Someone knocked on the door and they both looked over. Enter, Robert barked, and the door opened to reveal Sir Barristan Selmy, who was holding a message. Your Grace, this has arrived from Winterfell. The king took the proffered message with a nod to the Lord Commander of the King's Guard and then looked at it, his eyebrows flying up as he read it. Oh my, he said dryly, and then passed it over to him. As he read it, he could feel his own eyebrows rising as well. The king rubbed his chin and then called, Sir Barristan. The door opened again. Your Grace, could you please send word for Lord Omber and Mansraider to come here at once? I shall send word at once, Your Grace. As the door closed again, the king rose to his feet and strode about the room for a turn, before chuckling slightly. Gods, I wonder what Ned would say of this. I think that he would say that it would strengthen the North at a time when it needs all the help it can get, Your Grace. The younger man paused to mull that over, and then grinned and nodded. Aye, you have that right. After a short time, they both heard boots on floorboards outside, and then a loud knock. The king smiled at him, and then raised his voice. Enter. Great John Umber strode in first, followed by the former king beyond the wall, both of whom bowed before their king, the latter slightly more flamboyantly than the former. Your Grace, Raider said formally, you sent for us? The king nodded and then stood, before looking at them both with a slightly quizzical smile on his face. I did. Word has come from Winterfell. Lord Umber, young Ned Umber, has arrived there, escorted by Mors Umber. The great John looked pleased, but also a little confused by that. Oh, aye. Good news. Aye, indeed, but Mors Umber was able to confirm something once he arrived there. A party of wildlings, free folk, arrived, and one of them was Rowan Umber, the daughter of Mors. The Lord of the Last Hearth stood there, genuinely stunned. Finally, he found the words to say, "Truly, Rowan, I," the king said, with a certain something in his voice. "And he has acknowledged his granddaughters, Dalla and Val." He looked at the equally gobsmacked Mance Raider. "I believe that you are married to Dalla." The two men eyed each other, and he could see that Great John Umber was in two minds as to if he should laugh or swear violently. "I remember Rowan Umber well," the Lord of the Last Hearth rumbled. "She was taken by a bloody wildling, taken against her will. If that means that—" "Peace," Raider said, throwing his hands up. "I know the tale of Rowan, although she left out the facts about her birth. The man who stole her and took her north of the wall was not the father of Daxley Arvale. The man who took her made the mistake of letting his guard down around Rowan, and she castrated him and stuffed his cock and balls down his throat, killing him. The father of Daxley and Val was Gwyn, a good man, who won her heart. They were married before a heart tree." He winced a little. "He was killed fighting the others. I made sure he'd never rise again afterwards." There was a strained silence. Then the Great John nodded. "Good." He looked at Raider. "And when you married my cousin, was it before a heart tree?" "It was," Raider said firmly. "I made sure of that. Marriage customs amidst the free folk vary a lot, but I knew that I had to do it right." The king looked at them both and then nodded sharply, before looking at the message. "Good. Robb Stark writes that he requests that I make it clear that Dalla and Val are of House Umber, further binding the North and the free folk together. I agree, and declare it so. Anyone want to challenge that?" The Great John and Raider both hurriedly shook their heads. "Excellent, as it looks as if Robb Stark has his eye on Val Umber. After all, they both faced an attack by the mountain. Lord Umber, would you object to being linked by marriage to House Stark?" "Gods, never," Lord Umber said. "It would be a very great honor." "Then, Master Aemon, I need to send a message to Winterfell, if you please." "I will prepare one at once," he smiled, wondering a little at the chain of circumstances that had come together for this. "One moment. First you must witness something. Raider, kneel." The king stood, a great tall presence that seemed to fill the room with something on his face that made the former king, beyond the wall, go pale and then go down on one knee. Robert Baratheon reached out, pulled Stormbreaker from its scabbard and touched Raider lightly on both shoulders. "Rise, Lord Raider. You have served all of Westeros well. You have saved your people, helped the North, repaired relations between the North and the Free Folk, and bloody well earned your title. Ned Stark should be the one doing this, but he's not here, and I am. He'll sort out the details when he gets back. But know this now, you have done well." Raider seemed to be wrestling some great emotion, as he bowed his head and then stood almost shakily, as he seemed to fight to find the words he needed to say. Great John Umber strode to one side, poured out 4 goblets of wine, and then handed them out, starting with the king. "This isn't ale, but it'll do. Welcome, good cousin. Treat Daddle badly, and I'll have words to say." He chuckled, as did the others in the room, and they toasted the matter. It was not a fine wine, but it was better than he had been used to and would suffice. But then, as he prepared to go and send that message to Winterfell, there was the sound of hurried boots outside, raised voices, and then a rap on the door that opened at the king's command to reveal Ser Barristan, with another man who was holding a message. There was a red thread attached to it. A message for His Grace the King from the Lord Hand, marked most urgent. The king waved a hand, and the men bowed quickly, handed it over, and then stepped back. There was a moment of silence, and then the king looked up, his eyes wide and his mouth open. "Fetch the Lord Commander, Lord Lannister and his brothers, the Green Man, Ser Bryden Tully, Brienne of Tarth, Lord Tarley, and Lords Royce and Redford at once. Go, man." The messenger bowed hastily and then ran out as the king looked about the room. "We need a map. My lords, Master Aemon and the others have attacked Pike. According to Stannis, they failed. There were 3 of them and many whites, in an iceberg of all things. By all the gods, has this ever happened before?" Ice seemed to flow through his veins for a moment, and then he shook his head. "I do not recall reading of such an attack of that kind," he said, in a voice like iron. "But Lady Mormont did say that something had been happening off the frozen shore. Freezing fog. As I believe she put it." He walked as fast as he could over to a bookshelf, perused it briefly, and then pulled out a map, which he unrolled on the table. The others joined him there, and Raider hissed as he looked at the map. "So far south, but they failed." They failed. The king stared down at the message again. "Gods, this is strange. and then he frowned slightly. Wait. There's 2 messages here. The second message, again with a red thread, was pulled out and he stared at it. Hurried boots approached again outside, and then the Lannisters arrived, bowing and curious, followed by the Lord Commander and the others. My lords, the king rumbled. Word has come from Pike. The others attacked there. They failed, but Balon Greyjoy is dead. Him and his brother killed by their kinslaying brother. Asha Greyjoy is now Lady of the Iron Islands, acknowledged as such by the Lord Hand and myself. There was a moment of utter stillness, and then Tywin Lannister strode forward and took the first message from the proffered hand of the king. Gods, he said, sounding genuinely shocked. The others, at Pike, he narrowed his eyes and stared at the message. From the date of this... Wait, no word has come yet of any other attack. We had a raven from Shadow Tower this morning saying all was well there, the Lord Commander rumbled as he took the proffered message from the Lord of the Westerlands. And word from Bear Island just yesterday that all was well. He paused, and his eyes seemed to go somewhere in thought. Wait, when Meiji was here, she spoke of strange mists off the frozen shore. Mists that moved southwards. Could that have been this? It must have, surely. If they can outflank the wall... Lord Tarrant sounded as if he was deep in thought. Wait. Why Pike? Why now? Your Grace, my lords, this makes no sense. The king held out the second message. This hints at an answer. Balon Greyjoy and his religious lunatic of a brother Damfair were killed by their own brother, Euron. He literally vanished after the attack. But Stannis writes that Euron Greyjoy's ship was discovered and that a thing was found on it by Asha Greyjoy and Jon Stark. Some abomination of bone and flesh and blood, foul magic of some kind. They and others escaped it and burnt the ship down around it. The room was silent after he said those words. Brienne of Tarth swapped a worried gaze with the Blackfish, whilst Jaerion Lannister looked absolutely horrified, and then the Green Man stepped forwards, took the second message from the hand of the king and read it in full before handing it to Tywin Lannister, who read it as if it had personally offended him. But it was Jaerion Lannister that the Green Man turned to face. You once battled a Fleshsmith, I think, from the sound of it. And as you said, if you could make it into the Smoking Sea by being careful, then so could others. Euron Greyjoy is a man of foul reputation. I wonder he might have picked up from his travels, and now, it seems, he has allied himself with the others. But why? Jaerion Lannister said, bafflement in his voice. Why ally with the others? All they offer is death. He might seek to use them, Tywin Lannister said softly. The message says that he intends to kill the drowned god, and if he has indeed been to Valyria, then, well, who is to say that what came out of that cursed place was still entirely human? There are terrible tales of that place. Rosier nodded. After the Doom, many tried to go there and secure it. Few, if any, ever returned, and those that did either spoke of madness or were unable to speak anything at all. Lord Lannister is right. We must assume that Euron Greyjoy is not as we all are. Not now. Warning has gone to Old Town, the king said each word heavily. Ned will be warned. He'd better be warned. He looked at the map for a long moment and then straightened up. The attack on Pike might be a one-off, or it might be a precursor to a general outflanking of the Wall. Warning of the western shore of the north has been sent out. Winterfell should be aware by now. The coastlines of the Riverlands and the Westerlands must also be warned. The Vale, too. The king turned to Jira Mormont. Lord Commander Mormont, how goes the refurbishment of the castles on the Wall? There are parties of builders and volunteers working on all of them now. Some are approaching decent shape, some are still needing a lot of work. Create a list of what needs to be done to each castle and how urgent each one is. My lords, we must work harder than we have ever worked before on this. We must hold the Wall and be prepared for anything from now onwards. Call on whatever you can for this. I will send ravens today calling for yet more help. The realm stands or falls here at the Wall. They are coming for us. We'll spit in their face and deny them every inch of ground. So say I. What say you? So say we all. So say we all, your grace. The bellow filled the room, and as it did, there was the crack of lightning and thunder right above their heads that made the room almost shake. Stannis, he had to admit, begrudgingly, that the Ironborn could sail. They were beating down towards Great Wake, almost in the teeth of a hard westerly wind that some crews would have had trouble with. Not the crews of the little three-ship squadron that they were on. He also had to think that Asha Greyjoy would make a very good ruler of the Iron Islands. She might have been a Greyjoy, but she was free of her father's grasping malice and inability to admit when he was wrong, as well as the madness of two of her uncles and the brutal stolidity of the other. No, she took after her mother's family more than her father's, which nothing but good for the Iron Islands after all the mistakes that her father and his siblings had made. She was clever, knew when to admit that she was mistaken about something, and had a voice that could outbellow fools like Lord Dunstan Drum, who had sailed from Old Wyke with his sons and then arrived at Pike with a pompous speech about how the Ironborn would never follow a mere slip of a girl. Well, that slip of a girl had stared at the pompous fool as he droned on, a stare so hard and pointed that Drum's sons and followers quite quickly fell silent in their support for Drum. Not that he had seemed to notice at first. When he did, he faltered. And then Asha Greyjoy had stood and proceeded to tear Drum to verbal pieces, in the way that the Robert of a year ago might have demolished a roast boar. By the end, he'd almost felt sorry for the man who had been reduced to a red-faced state of humiliation, unable to match the power of her voice or the fact that, as she said, she was giving him one chance to be silent before she ordered his throat be cut. Stannis had then stood, nodded at Asha Greyjoy, and then simply said, "As the hand of the king, I can say that the Iron Throne recognizes Asha Greyjoy as the ruler of the Iron Islands. Her father willed it, the Reader supports her, the Iron Throne supports her. House Stark supports her, and House Baratheon of Dragonstone supports her." Drum had stared at him, looking like a man who had totally miscalculated everything, whilst his sons had looked as if they wanted the ground to open up and swallow them. And that had been that. They had all but slunk from the room, glaring a little at Ygritte Stark's comment that Drum was a pompous fart, all stink and dribble. He'd been impressed by her then, and he'd also seen the way that Theon Greymist had watched his sister as she had gone about the work of ruling at Pike. He had known that the boy could be prone to boastfulness and bragging, and after hearing the terrible tale of the future that Robb Stark had seen, he'd wondered why the Starks now trusted him. The man who had captured Winterfell in that other future and possibly killed Brandon and Rickon Stark. But that Theon Greyjoy was gone. In his place was Theon Greymist, someone who seemed to think a great deal before he did things. There were times when he could see him opening his mouth with a sly smile to perhaps make a jape, or suggest something off the top of his head, and then pause, rethink, and change direction from where he had been going. He knew that the boy had been told what he had done in that other future, and that he had been horrified by it all. Ned Stark had had a huge impact on the former heir to the Iron Islands. And now the call in Robb Stark's tale had also had an impact. Theon Greymist was not Theon Greyjoy. Not anymore. Well now, it remained to be seen where the lad would go from here. Someone hailed the ship from one of the other vessels, and he looked over to see that the Reader was gesturing to one side. Great Wyke could be seen. A small shape on the horizon partially shrouded from view by sea mist. He had not seen it since Balon Greyjoy's foolish rebellion, which had cost the Ironborn so dearly. He had been surprised when Asha Greyjoy had announced that she was traveling there, but then he had heard that she had almost been summoned there by a message from the Stonebrows, the leaders of those who had hidden their worship of the old gods on the Iron Islands. Lil Stonebrow was apparently dying, and she wanted to see Asha at once. Given the nature of the rupture that had divided the Iron Islands so badly, he could see why the trip was necessary. Orders were roared from various throats, and he looked up to see that pennants were being hoisted on all three ships. All were flying the flag of the Greyjoys. But now the ship he was standing on was also flying as Shaka Greyjoy's personal standard, whilst the right-hand ship was flying that of the Reader. As they tacked into the Great Bay of the island and started to approach the little harbor that he could see that they were steering towards, he could also see that there was a crowd gathering there. Perhaps someone with keen eyes or a Mirish spyglass had seen them approach, but they did not seem to be hostile. And then, as they docked and the various passengers assembled on the decks of the various ships, he could almost feel the mood of the crowd shift from caution to cautious hope, and then to something else when they caught sight of first the direwolves and then the green cloak and horned hood of the green man who had accompanied them. Alwyn of the Isle of Faces was standing there on the deck, a silent figure with a knapsack with a pot containing a weirwood tree sapling at his feet. He eyed the crowd, wondering what they were thinking. The last time he had been to Great Wyke had been to conquer it during Balon Greyjoy's doomed rebellion. He'd been responsible for the deaths of many on the island, but now, as he came to think about it, none of them had been Stonebrows. At the time he'd thought that parts of the island had merely acknowledged the reality of the situation, of the overwhelming power that the Iron Throne could bring to bear against the Iron Islands. He wasn't so sure now. What was especially interesting were the murmurs rising from the crowd. Stark was one of the words on many lips, the call were other words, and then Green Man. There was something in the air, not dangerous, but something that he could not describe or define. As the gangplank thumped down, and Asha Greyjoy's guards and crew flowed down it, he could see her almost twitching with impatience to be ashore again. And then she was off, striding down and then looking at the crowd, before smiling slightly. Bajan Stonebrow. Ned Stonebrow. I take it that your mother still lives. She does, the older of the men said. And Stannis looked them over. They were hawk-nosed, dressed in browns and greens, with a badge embroidered on their tunics of a white tree on a red background. She has little time left, though. You must see her at once. The Green Man and the others, too. Things happened rapidly after that. Horses had been brought for them, and he paused to wonder as to why there were the exactly correct number for their party. And then they rode up the long hill, banners snapping in the wind. The Stonebrows led them to a long house made of stone and timber, with a roof that seemed to have been retiled recently. There were more guards at the doorway that they strode through, and he noticed their livery again. The Stonebrows seemed to be stronger in numbers and in influence than Asha Greyjoy had said, and he could see the same realization on her face. And then they came to the room where Elise Stonebrow lay on a bed, a white-haired, shrunken figure. Yes, she was dying, but as Asha Greyjoy approached where she lay, she opened her eyes and then smiled. A smile with a remarkable number of teeth. For a woman of her age. I knew you would come. I dreamt it. She paused and then seemed to gather her remaining strength. My lord, Asha Greyjoy, ruler of the Iron Islands, long may you rule. Long will you rule. Asha Greyjoy looked at her before nodding choppily, tears in her eyes before she went over and knelt by the bed. You told me to come, so I came. Is there nothing? The old woman shook her head and ran her hand down Asha Greyjoy's face. No, nothing. As I told you, death comes as an old friend to take the pain away. But there are things that must be done first. She looked at Theon Greymist, whose face was white with strain. Theon, come here. The lad approached and knelt next to his sister. Old Graham, I remember you, and you have done the right thing. Never forget that. You chose the North. You were right to. You have killed whites. You saw what must be done, and you have turned away from that boastful, vain, empty other self that you could have been. Never forget that. Never. It must become your strength. A gnarled finger jabbed at his chest, and then, as if tired, she leant back before looking at Jon Stark. You made a good marriage, my boy. A good woman. Your children will be strong. Remember what you are. Remember your heritage. It will be important in the war on the wall. I will, Jon Stark said, looking strained. Thank you. There was a pause, and then the old woman looked at the Green Man. We have waited a long time for you. Alwyn nodded, yes, and now your wait is over. She shifted in her bed and looked out of the window for a moment. There was a heart tree near here once. My ancestors chopped it down to appease a drowned man who would have killed them otherwise. I am sorry. You should not be. Your ancestors did what they had to stay safe. The drowned god is a jealous god. A dying god. I know. Alwyn smiled a little. The roots are still there. They have always been there, deep in the soil. They were waiting. Deep roots are not touched by the frost. They hid just as you did. There was a moment of stunned silence, and then Elise Stonebrow slowly and painfully sat up in bed and grasped the hand of the Green Man. What are you saying? Alwyn patted her hand for a moment, and then unslung the rucksack from his back and held it in front of him so that she could, with trembling fingers, touch the red leaves and white bark of the sapling. Give me a few minutes outside, and a spade. I know where to dig. Banjin. The old woman snapped a word with a voice of command. Give him what he needs. The two men departed, and, as they did so, Eloy Stonebrow laboriously started to pull the sheets aside. Asel, help me up. Ned, give me a knife. A sharp one. As she stood, supported by Asha Greyjoy and dressed in her white robes, she smiled a little. I hoped of this. I dreamt once of this. And then she was hobbling towards the door, where she waited for a moment. When the door opened again, it was to reveal Alwyn of the Isle of Faces, who bowed to the old woman respectfully and then led her out into the sunshine. People were muttering in awe to one side, and as he followed them out, he realized why. The weirwood tree had been planted in a spot well away from the building, and it seemed to have shot up in size at least 6 feet and grown in girth. He gaped at it, and then he heard Elide's Stonebrow sigh in contentment. "I dreamt of this once." She knelt at the foot of the tree. "Thank you. The roots were always there. Your family and others never forgot." The old gods remembered, as did the tree. "Thank you again." She laid a hand on the trunk of the tree. "Ned." "Mother, give it to me." The man handed the knife over to his mother, and then she drew the knife over her palm, without displaying any sign of pain, before placing the bloodied palm over the trunk of the weirwood tree. "Old gods, hear me now! We were faithful. We were true. We hid in the darkest of times, but we did not forget. We will never forget. So, take what little I have left, and use it to fight the others." And with that, Aegis Stonebrow stiffened and then fell to the ground, lifeless. And as he looked at the tree, it seemed to grow upwards, and what might have been the beginnings of a face formed on the trunk of the tree. Robb, he felt almost as if he was hiding here, in this passageway, sitting opposite the strange doorway that he hadn't been able to open yet. There was so much to do, what with Father being away in the Reach and the King being at Castle Black. He thought about Val for a moment and then closed his eyes for a long moment before forcing them open again. He had to wait until a raven came back from Castle Black, from the King and also the Greatjon. He had to plan this out and not be impulsive. He wanted her, and he knew that she wanted him, but the last time he'd thought with his cock instead of his brain, he'd ended up with crossbow bolts in his chest and then a knife in his heart. So he had to be more clinical about this. Was that the word? He'd heard Tyrion use it once. Hopefully he had that right. He closed his eyes and warged once again into Grey Wind so that he could stare at the mysterious door in the wall opposite them both, drinking in every detail. And then he jumped back again and then sketched a few more details of the door on the piece of paper he'd pinned to the corkboard on his lap. Yes, he hadn't imagined it. The handprints in the middle of the door were different. They were smaller, with just 3 fingers and a thumb. They were for a child of the forest. "It always sends a slight chill through me when you do that," said a voice to one side, and he looked up to see Tyrion and Daisy watching them both. "It's the white eyes. Disturbing." He laughed softly and handed the drawing over to the pair. Mother can't really watch any of us warg even now. She always grimaces and puts her hand over her eyes." He scratched Grey Wind behind the ears, making the direwolf huff with pleasure. "But warging is the only way to see that damn doorway." There was a pause as Tyrion and Daisy looked at the drawing before looking at each other. "Aye," Tyrion said eventually. "These runes, though, they are in the language of the First Men, and an archaic form at that." "Robb, the crypts are amongst the oldest parts of Winterfell," Daisy said quietly. "And the runes are old as well, and we're not entirely sure what they mean." "Plain can sing, talk to plain, singing, freedom in the sky birthed," Tyrion said as he looked at the picture. "I know, it makes little sense. I think that the concept behind some of the words has been lost or changed over the years." Plain, a memory stirred for a moment in his mind. Something about Father's vision when all of this had started, but he thrust that aside. "The handprints must mean something, though." "Yes, but what?" Daisy stood in front of the door and ran her hands over it. "I feel nothing. Not a thing. Not a line, and—" She froze for an instant as just for a second very faint lines appeared in the stone, as if the doorway had shimmered into partial sight for a heartbeat. "What was that?" "That was the door," Robb breathed as he stood hurriedly. "Do that again, Daisy." She ran her hands over the wall again, but this time nothing happened. "I don't understand." "Wait," said Tyrion, clasping his hands together and rubbing them in a line from his chin to just under his nose. "Wait," and then he stepped forwards and ran his hands all over the wall, watching carefully as he did so. "Robb, can you please warg in the Grey Wind, and then tell us, howl or something, when my hands pass over one of the handprints? Point with a paw or something." He sat back down, placed a hand on Grey Wind's head, and shifted again, suddenly seeing through the eyes of his direwolf. Tyrion's hands were moving in roughly the right direction, and when they finally passed over the rightmost of the 3 sets of handprints, he whuffed with emphasis, which felt strange indeed. Tyrion froze. "Robe? My right hand? Or my left?" He shifted back and then stood. "Left." Tyrion looked at the wall, and we see nothing. Very well. Time to test a theory. Daisy, put your hand, either of them, where my left hand is as I remove it. Ready? Go. Daisy put her hand on the wall on the spot they had indicated, and then they all gasped as faint lines started to appear on the wall, going upwards and outwards until the faintest of outlines could be seen of the carvings on the doorway. How did that? Robb breathed and then went still. Wait, the night fort. Tyrion all but crowed. The lock on the crypt's there. When others tested it was intact, but the moment that you touched it, it fell apart. Magic tied to House Stark. When I touched the handprint, there was nothing there. But when Daisy, who is part Stark, touched it, it activated. We have our answer. What if I touch the other set of human handprints on the left? Robb gazed at the wall, assessing roughly where the other carvings were. Daisy, place your other hand about 2 inches from the one on the wall. That should be the right place. And then he strode over and ran his hand slowly over the place where he was sure the other carvings were. The faint lines seemed to shimmer for a moment, and then deepen and appear more distinct. They were more visible now, and the carvings could be seen more clearly, but they were still tenuous in places. I'm not a full Stark, Daisy whispered in disappointment. Robb, we need your brothers and sisters. Tyrion smirked and then turned his head so that he faced the part of the passage that led to the outside. There was a confused noise for a moment, and then a cautious, tousled head hoved into view in the distance. What? The word was said with a combination of suspicion and annoyance that he had been discovered, and judging by the sudden muttering of others in the distance, his little brother was not alone. Get your sisters and then come down here, Robb roared. Maester Lewin too. There was a further confused noise, and then the head vanished. Robb looked at the others and rolled his eyes. The terrible foursome are still convinced that Vermax's eggs are somewhere in Winterfell, and then think that they might be behind the doors here. Tyrion and Daisy both rolled their eyes at this, but then looked back at the lines on the wall. What can this be? Daisy breathed. It was Arya who arrived first. An Arya who had mud on her feet and a smear of either dirt or dust on her cheek. And Robb smothered a smile at what Mother would say on seeing her. Arya, underfoot, had obviously been exploring again. What's going on? She came to a halt in the passage and looked at the wall with wide eyes. What's that? Magic, the three almost chorused before eyeing each other and then laughing a little. Something our ancestors hid, Arya, Robb answered her, tied to our blood. Arya, can you go over to where Daisy is now and put your hands where hers are now? Why? Arya asked, but she still moved over to Daisy, who showed her where to place her hands. And then, as she did so, she froze as the lines shimmered again and then deepened. Excited, Arya looked about. This is magic? Aye, said Robb, and then he looked around as Bran arrived with others. Sansa and of course the Merrick were amongst the first, then Mother and Maester Lewin, and then the curious remainder of the terrible foursome and of course Yrene. All slowed and gaped at the doorway. It's magic that's linked to the Starks, Tyrion explained with an expansive gesture at the door. Daisy's hands gave us the hint when she touched the right place on the wall by accident. Stark blood activates it. Does it open? Edric asked, as eager as any of them. Then he frowned. There are no dragon eggs on the carvings. Edric, Mother said gently, I fear that this was closed and unknown when Vermax was here. This is ancient. The young Baratheon frowned in confusion at that, but then looked at the door again. But does it open? Everyone looked at the door, and then Tyrion walked forwards and pushed at where the doors joined. But nothing happened. I had to push as there's nowhere to pull, he muttered as he stepped back, and then sighed. It's the third handprints, isn't it? It was Dalmeric who asked the question, or rather stated the obvious, and Robb nodded thoughtfully as he looked at them. 3 fingers and a thumb, and small hands at that. He felt as if he had dropped a dragon and found a stag. The hands of the children of the forest. Who are? Sadly anywhere but here, Tyrion mused. There was one north of the wall, but she died as Mance Rayder told us. And there are, based on the Green Man's cryptic comments, some on the Isle of Faces, which is reassuring, because they were thought to be extinct. Perhaps a raven to house one at Harrenhal, or another lordly house close to the Isle. As Mother seemed to think this over and then turned to Lewin, there was a sudden interruption. I know where there's a child of the forest. Everyone stared at Bran, who had turned bright red and was shifting from foot to foot uneasily. What was that, sweetling? Mother asked uncertainly. I know where there's a child of the forest. Bran said the words in a less rushed manner, and they all stared at him. "You do not," Arya said, with a combination of indignation and confusion. "I do too," Bran snapped. Robb swapped a glance with Mother, who knelt by his brother's side. "Sweetling, are you sure about this? This isn't something you've dreamt?" But Bran shook his head vehemently, before drooping slightly as his friends all stared at him with a mix of betrayal and bafflement. "I met her more than a week ago. She's called Quicksilver, and she told me that I had to keep her presence a secret. She said that I couldn't tell anyone until the right time." He looked at the doorway. "Isn't this the right time?" There was a moment of quiet confusion. "And this Quicksilver is where?" Mother asked, bemusedly. "The Godswood, Mother," Bran said quietly. He looked deeply uneasy. "I gave my word to her that I wouldn't tell anyone about her. I had to keep my word. But this is important. Isn't it, Robb?" He looked at his brother and realized that he was very serious and indeed on the brink of tears. "It is, Bran. It's all right, you did the right thing." "So, you saw her there?" Bran seemed to slump more than a little in relief. "Yes." His brow wrinkled in confusion. "She said that we're linked somehow, and she kissed me, on the lips, cheeks, and forehead, like it meant something." Someone, perhaps Daisy, seemed to gasp at that, but he didn't know why. He looked at his brother. "Rain, can you take me to this Quicksilver?" Bran looked at him solemnly, and then he nodded. Brilliant. He was both excited and dreading this. Keeping Quicksilver a secret had been the hardest thing he'd ever done in his life. He'd wanted to tell his friends so very badly that there was an actual child of the forest living in the Godswood, but he couldn't. And now he'd had to tell everyone, and he could feel their betrayed looks on his back even as he led Robb to the Godswood, with Summer and Grey Wind flanking them and Mother and Daisy following them. They seemed to be having a strained talk about something. But before they got to the Godswood, Daisy called on them to stop for a moment. He turned and looked at her, and also at Mother, who had a peculiar look on her face. "What's amiss?" Robb asked with a frown. "Firstly, we need to warn people not to hurt Quicksilver when she comes with us," Daisy said quietly. "This is too important to risk her life. No one has seen a child of the forest here in Winterfell in centuries. People will be surprised." "A good point," Robb said slowly. He looked around. Jari, the captain of the guard, who was walking with his uncle in the distance, strode quickly over to them. "Lord Robb." Robb glanced at Bran. "According to Bran, there's a child of the forest here in the Godswood. Warn the guards and household staff that if they see her, her name is Quicksilver, they are not to harm her in any way." Brienne nodded firmly, and then realized that the castles were both gaping at Robb with astonishment. "And as you say, my lord," and with that they strode off, talking and then splitting apart. "There is something else," Daisy said quietly. "Brienne, those kisses she gave you? What order were they in again?" He frowned in puzzlement. And then he pointed at his forehead, his left cheek, his right cheek, and then, blushing, his lips. Daisy pulled her skirts up a little and then knelt beside him. "We know very little about the children of the forest," she muttered, and there was regret in her voice. "But my father gathered as much as he could about them in his research, and we know that they had certain values, certain ties to the world around them." She touched her own forehead. Thought. She touched her left cheek. Eternity. She touched her right cheek. Dedication, and then she touched her lips. Heart. Brain stared at her. "Does that mean something?" "It means that you two are linked. Firmly linked." She seemed to be amused by something, and then she looked at Mother. "Your good daughters will be interesting." Mother blinked at this, and then she went white. "Are you sure?" she said, the words in a strangled manner that made Bran look at her worriedly. "I am." And then Daisy stood again. "Cat, sometimes things are the way that fate has written them. I think that this is one of those things." Which was confusing, but before he could ask what she meant, she walked off towards the Godswood and he scurried to follow, and then lead them. Summer again, bounding by his side. As they entered the Godswood, he looked about worriedly, even as he took a deep breath of air into his lungs. He did so love this place. The smells of grass under his feet and wood and leaves and water were all things that made him feel connected to the old gods. Where was Quicksilver, though? As they walked towards the heart tree, he wondered if he should call out to her. And then he stopped dead in his tracks when she stepped out from behind the tree. She was wearing a red jerkin this time, and her hair seemed to be braided slightly differently. Robb also stopped, and his eyes widened as he saw her. Mother and Daisy also came to a halt. The direwolves, oddly, did not, They strode over to Quicksilver, sniffed at her face and hands for a long moment, and then sat down, almost at her feet, as she smiled at them. And then she looked at him. "Hello, Bran." He strode up to her, ignoring the odd noise that came from Mother. "Hello, Quicksilver. I'm sorry. I know I said I'd keep you a secret, but we found this door in the crypts, and Robb said we need a child of the forest to open it, and you're not upset, are you?" "No, I'm not. It is as I dreamt it. It's time." She looked at Robb and the others. "Hello, I am Quicksilver, as Bran has already told you." He looked back at them. Mother was pale as a ghost, Robb looked flabbergasted, and Daisy had an odd smile on her face. "I greet you with earth and water, air and stone, in the name of the old gods," Daisy said suddenly in the language of the first men. "Little sister," Quicksilver smiled and bowed at that. "I thank you for your greeting, your welcome, and your protection." And then she looked at Robb. "So you are the one. When you came back, the trees on the Isle of Faces spoke your name." He frowned in confusion. "Came back?" Robb had never been away. "Much has changed," Robb said slowly, "and much forgotten. Your pardon, I never thought I'd ever see a child of the forest. I thought you were all gone." Quicksilver smiled. "We were protected on the Isle of Faces. We waited. And now that the call has been sent and the true enemy identified, we can walk the land again, through the secret places that the green men have tended." "We need your help," Bran said. "The door? Then we shall open it." She strode up to him, took his hand, and led him across the godswood in the direction of the crypts. The dire wolves followed them at once, and then the others seemed to shake themselves out of their shock and came as well. When they walked out of the godswood, he could hear the mutter, as people saw Quicksilver. But Jory and his uncle seemed to have spoken to a lot of people, and no one seemed too alarmed. He could understand if some had been, but she was not a threat to anyone. As she strode next to him, her hand in his, it felt right, her palm on his, and he seemed to sense a pulse from that hand, a strong and steady one that said that she was calm. As they entered the passageway that led to the door, he could hear the muttering from Arya ahead of him, protesting at having to wait, and which suddenly stopped when they came into view. "Hello," he said, as they approached a very wide-eyed Maester Luwin. Arya, Sansa, Edric, Robert, Ned, Daenerys, and Tyrion. "This is Quicksilver." The child of the forest swept them all with her red eyes. "I am honored to meet you all." And then she turned to face the doors, which could just still be seen as Oxliet had one hand on the wall. "Oxliet, please put your other hand on the wall. Robb, please do the same on the other side." Ruzier did as she was told, but then frowned. "How did you know my name?" "I know many things," Quicksilver said as she waited for Robb to move into place. "I am glad to know that you have been turned from one fate in a future that will now never be." "What?" "Another time. Now." She placed her hands on the small handprints in the middle of the door, and then Bran gasped as the door glowed brighter and brighter, as if the sun was suddenly shining from it briefly. And then Quicksilver pushed, and the door opened with a groan and a scrape of stone on stone, each part of it swinging back into the darkness beyond. There was a chamber in there, in shadow. There was a stunned silence that was broken by Maester Luwin. "I shall fetch lanterns, my lords and ladies." And then he strode off with a surprising turn of speed for man who was so old. Bran edged up to the door and glanced into it. It was dark in there, and there was a smell of stuffy air. "Rian, please step back," Tyrion said softly. "We know that door hasn't been opened for some time. The air might be foul. Like under the godswood at Storm's End." Edric asked. "Sure, Barristan, Salme warned father against the air there." There was a pause as they waited, and then Edric, Robert, and Ned turned to him. "Why didn't you tell us about her?" Edric said with a flail of his hands in frustration. "She told me not to." "Why?" "She was a secret." "We can keep a secret." "Would you believe me without seeing her?" The other three looked at him as if they were both impressed by his point, but also disgusted by it. "They would not have," Quicksilver said with a sigh. "You humans sometimes can only see as far as what is in front of you." Footsteps heralded the return of Maester Luwin and the Castles, both of whom looked at Quicksilver as if they doubted the evidence of their own eyes, and Bran found himself realizing that she had a point. They all bore lanterns in both hands, and they were quickly shared about. "Right," said Robb with a bit of a quaver in his voice. "Let's be about this," and then he stepped into the doorway. Bran gulped and then followed him in, with the others joining them. The room was wide, with well-dressed stone on all sides and flagstones that looked, well, less worn than the other parts of the floors of the crypts. Some had runes on them, like a pattern that repeated itself here and there, but there was very little dust. How could that be? And then he saw the throne. It had to be a throne. Surely. It was stone, large and impressive, and it sat on the far wall opposite the doorway, and it was carved all over. Robb and Tyrion stopped dead in their tracks as they saw it, and Bran looked at them in confusion. They had almost identical looks of shock on their faces. "Robb, what's wrong?" "It's like the chair at the Night Fort," Robb muttered as he lifted his lantern and stared at it. "The throne, if you can call it that only a Stark can sit in, as otherwise it sends them mad. Why would there be another one here?" "Because they are linked," Quicksilver said solemnly. "A Stark who sits in one can talk to a Stark that sits in the other. The wall can talk to Winterfell, and Winterfell to the wall. And more than that, Winterfell here, hence the name. The first king of the others was fed to the heart tree here. There has always been magic here, in the very stones under Winterfell, in the warm water that pulses through it. Bran the Builder built something special that has endured, and those two thrones, they were grown out of the same stone, by a stone singer." "Stone singers," Daisy whispered the word, before looking at Tyrion. "Wargs are rare. Green seers are rarer still, but stone singers, men and women who can shape stone with their voice and a gesture, they are so rare that few have ever been recorded." "Bring the Builder was one," Quicksilver said quietly. "It's in the blood of Starks. It has slept for a long time. It's time for it to wake up." And then she looked at him. "Jazz-yay." He sighed as he saddled his horse and then cinched the various bits correctly. There had been a time when he would have had a squire or a groom to do this. These days he did it all himself, as there was no one else, not for the Kingslayer. Turning from his horse, he caught sight of Adam, who was leaning against a post and looking mullish. "I still think that I should go with you." "No," Yami said, with a wry smile. "The offer is appreciated, though. But you were not invited, and given the nature of the man who did the inviting, that might be important." Adam pulled a face. "You don't even know where you're going, just north of the wall." "I've always wanted to travel and see something of the world," Yami quipped, before sobering. "Adam, I know you. Don't follow us. Besides, I need you to do something for me." His oldest friend pulled another face before sighing. "Very well, what?" "Train Joffrey whilst I'm away." This brought him a stare and another sigh. "Will he listen to me?" "He will. I've told him to. A command from his father." "You do know that I might have to kick his arse to get him to listen at times, don't you?" "Kick away." He stared at his feet for a moment. "You might kick some sense into him. The boy still harbors dreams of returning to King's Landing. I see it in his eyes at times. Cersei spoiled him too much, and now he's here and only now starting to come to terms with it all. I know, the men have been talking of him, and few like him." Adam strode towards him and held out a hand. "Very well, I'll keep an eye on the boy and kick his arse about the training yard when required." "Good," Jaime said as he clasped the hand of his friend. "Thank you, Adam. And yes, I'll tell you what this trip north of the wall was all about, when we get back." As he led his horse out into the courtyard, he could see that the Green Man was already there, along with the Blackfish and Brienne of Tarth, all of whom were talking quietly with the Lord Commander and Maester Aemon. As he approached, they looked at him, nodded, and then the three in green cloaks mounted their horses. As he also mounted his horse, he could see that many others were watching them all in the courtyard in front of the gate, from the king, who was watching from a high balcony with Sir Barristan Selmy and father next to him, to a group of recruits that included a pale-faced Joffrey in front of Sir Lyser Thorne. And then, after a wave of the arm from the Green Man, they were off, trotting slowly across the courtyard and then into the tunnel that led beneath the wall. As they rode, he could hear the echoes of hooves on the stones beneath them, and not for the last time he wondered about the men who had first built this monstrous thing. He shivered as they rode out of the far end of the tunnel and then faced the winds there. The cold north wind was blowing, one that seemed to promise snow and ice, and he thanked Tyrion's meticulous notes about what to wear at the wall and in what order he should wear it. He thought about his little brother for a moment, and then smiled. He hoped that he was truly as happy with his wife as his letters had said. "Perhaps I should now tell you where we are bound, Sari Hame." The Green Man's words broke into his reverie. "Perhaps you should. Where exactly are we off to?" "You merely mentioned a wander north of the wall. We head towards the Fist of the First Men, and then I think northeast from there." I will have a better idea once we get closer. The ties between north of the wall and south of it are still strengthening, but I should have a good idea of our destination soon. This made no sense, and something must have been seen on his face, because the green man laughed softly. Hey, I know. Sounds like madness. It's not. We ride to a place that the children of the forest have known for many a year. They are not a people who use maps that we men would understand. More madness. Sir Duncan Greenman, the children of the forest are extinct, or so my brother told me. The three riders in green all laughed at that, and he felt his cheeks flush in anger. What? Your pardon, Sir Jaime, but they are very much alive, said Brienne of Tarth, with a smile that made her look almost comely. We have seen them on the Isle of Faces. Your brother merely was misinformed. The smile faltered. They were protected on the Isle from those who would have killed them. Speaking of things that would have killed them, the green man broke in. Sark Jaime, should at any point on our trip north I tell you to get off your horse at once and hug the nearest tree, you must do so. I must? You must. Because if I do so, it means that an other is approaching, and that time is of the essence, and that if you don't do exactly as I order, then you will die. He said the words in a way that made Jaime look at him suddenly. He was very serious. Very well. He licked his lips, which suddenly seemed to be very dry. And what will we be doing at this place? The green man seemed to go somewhere within himself for a long moment before returning. Tell me, Sir Jaime, have you ever heard of Lord Brynden Rivers? He blinked at that, then he frowned. Tyrion once told me of him. He was a bastard son of Aegon the Unworthy, one of those legitimized by the fat fool. Blood Raven, some called him. He was a hand of two kings, I think, and then sent to the wall by, and then he blanched and eyed the green man, Aegon the Unlikely. The old man smiled slightly at the mention of his dearest friend. Quite right, Sir Jaime. Very good. Why ask of him? We're off to meet him. He gaped at the green man. But that's not possible. As ancient as I am, the green man looked at him with a grin and a gleam in his eye, before sighing and shaking his head a little. I went to the Isles of Faces and learnt much there. He did not. From what I sensed from the earth, the water and the trees, he extended his life in a different way, and we must talk to him. And then the green man clapped his heels to his horse and led them in a gallop north through the trees. Rosier Lodge. He sat in Father Solar and stared at the wall opposite, with a certain sense of almost bewilderment. There was a child of the forest in the godswood of Winterfell, and she seemed to be linked in some fashion to his little brother. In fact, based on what had been said so far, there was an excellent chance that she would be his good sister. Mother had retired to her room and was probably still recovering from the very concept of the possibility that Bran's future wife might not be human. It was a thought that made him sigh and then shake his head a little. To one side, Greywind waffled in his sleep. In the meantime, there was the reality that was the chair in the room that they had discovered. The chair that made his hackles rise just looking at it. Yes, it was almost exactly like the chair in the Night Fort, or so he thought. The chair tied specifically to his family, or perhaps it might be better to say his blood. The chair that drove anyone who was not a Stark mad if they sat in it. It was all important. He could tell that. His ancestors wouldn't have built them or placed them or whatever it was that they had done to create them. Brant the Builder, perhaps. Was that the secret to all the things that his ancestor had built? Knuckles rapped on the door, and he looked up to see Tyrion standing there. Robb, do you have a moment? He waved a hand and the little man closed the door behind him, walked tiredly in and sat in a chair. You seem to be as bemused as I am, Tyrion sighed. It's been an interesting day. A child of the forest here in Winterfell. I thought that they were extinct. We truly live in a new age of wonders. An age that our ancestors predicted would come one day, Robb replied somberly. They knew it, they planned for it. And here we are, stumbling in the near dark, wondering what they had planned, through the haze of the ages. The haze of the ages, you're waxing lyrical there, Robb, Tyrion said with a smile. Then he sobered. There's no reference to the chair in any records here in Winterfell. I take it. Not a word. Another secret that a Stark took to the grave? More than likely, the door also requires a child of the forest. We don't even know the last time that one was here. Tyrion nodded, before leaning forwards. Then Daisy and I must go to Surestone as soon as possible. Not just to ascertain that the library there has been restored after Boodle's thefts, but to see if the old Lord Surestone had any records of anything that might be related to this. If the Surestones were indeed the recorders of the history of the North, then there might be records that we need to know about. This made sense, and Robb nodded thoughtfully. I agree. When will you go? In a day or so. A flying visit, as fast as we can. Not as fast as our now legendary ride down from the wall, but as fast as we can. I have a few Lannister guardsmen as an escort, but I'd be grateful for a handful of Stark guardsmen too, in recognition of Daisy's own Stark blood. We'll send them back, of course in return with a few Surestone guards. Daisy has already sent word. Good, Robb said. Agreed. A good idea. A silence fell, and then Tyrion looked at him quizzically. I take it that you are awaiting a raven from the wall? This made him smile slightly. Aye. On if Val is an Umber or not, as declared by the king and also Lord Umber. Aye. He sighed and rubbed a hand over his face. Tyrion. He looked at the door to make sure it was closed. In that other time, I did not act with wisdom in my marriage. I married from, well, what I thought was love and the right thing to do after. Say no more, Tyrion said with upraised hands. A different time. A different world. The politics of this time have changed. The North needs the wildlings. The free folk. Call them what you may. Your father is right. They can grow the North in ways that few would have thought. Val is key to that. The fact that you love her and she loves you is a wondrous gift to you both. It's both political and personal, and the latter trumps the former in a way. He nodded choppily. Yes, but what if the king says no? Then the king would be a fool, but the king is not of the North, and is not a fool. Nor will he say no. I will wager any amount you like that he says yes. He would do anything for the son of Ned Stark. Taking in a long breath, he looked at the ceiling. Then he looked back at Tyrion. I'll have a word with the castles. The guards you take to Surestone will be good men. Thank you, Robb. Tyrion smiled, got down from the chair, and walked out. Robb sat there for a while longer before shaking his head and standing. Enough. Enough wool gathering. And then he heard the sound of hurried boots in the corridor and looked at the door as Maester Luwin arrived there, puffing more than a bit as he held out a curl of paper that was obviously a raven message. Lord Robb, from his grace, the king. From a fast raven. With a hand that he commanded to stop shaking, he took the message. It was from the king. He read it, and all of a sudden he stilled. He looked at Luwin and nodded. Thank you. Where? Outside the great hall. He nodded, clicked his tongue at Grey Wind, who had already woken up and was looking at him, and then strode out, feeling almost dazed. He found Val indeed outside the great hall, talking quietly with her mother, grandfather, and very pregnant sister. As he approached, they all looked at him, and then Val seemed to read something in his face, and paled. Robb? Lord Robb, what's amiss? Nothing's amiss, he said thickly, before looking at the message, swallowing and then clearing his throat. I have a message from His Grace the King, Robert Baratheon, the first of his name. He has conferred with Lord Umber, given the circumstances of your birth, but also what has happened since. He straightened up and looked her in the eye. You are Vale Umber. Your sister is also an Umber. She is also Lady Rhaegar, after the ennoblement of her husband. Dalla and her mother both gasped and then looked at each other, whilst Mor Somber nodded and grunted happily. Val, however, seemed to draw herself up almost regally and then looked at him. Thank you, Lord Robb, Val said after a moment. Lady Val, he replied. All of a sudden, he seemed to be unable to speak properly, and then he swallowed and stepped forwards and caught her hands in his own. I would be honored beyond words if you would consider me as a suitor for your hand in marriage. She just looked at him for a long moment. Robb Stark, she said eventually, you are a formal idiot, and I love you for it. You saved my life at least once. Yes, and then she kissed him. Hungrily. Ned. He had to admit to feeling a growing sense of unease as the ship he was on beat its way into the great harbor of Old Town as the sun rose in the east. Just looking at the high tower made the unease grow. There was something about the place that made him feel strange, as if there was something in the huge structure that was looking at him. Whatever he was feeling, Frostfire felt it too. The moment that he had laid eyes on the high tower, she had been there by his side, growling in a low, rolling tone that seemed to shake the deck under her feet. He could sense the message she was giving off in an instant. Danger. What does she sense? Paxter Redwine looked a worried man, his balding head creased with a frown. Danger, Ned muttered. Just that danger. And I feel it too. There's something there. The drowned bloody god, Paxter spat bitterly. God's bloody Ironborn. Ned nodded and then looked out at the wharves and docks of Old Town as they passed them. Crowds were growing there, silent and tense. Word had obviously passed of their arrival, and he wondered who was in that crowd. Were there members of the Faith Militant watching the ship? Ironborn, he was a worshipper of the old gods. Did anyone resent that? What was the word on the street about why he was here? Would anyone want to stop him because they wanted a septon to try and cleanse the gate? He sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. He just wanted to get this over and done with, and then go home. But the more he thought about it, the more he almost despaired of the task ahead of him. He was going to confront a god. A weakened, insane god. But still a god. It was like something out of the Age of Legends, and he was no Bran the Builder or Garth Greenhand. He was just Ned Stark. Frostfire turned to look at him and let out a whuffing noise that sounded like admonishment, and he smiled slightly. All right, he was just Ned Stark, near warg with a dire wolf that made Groan go pale and tremble when it growled at them. Where to, Ned? Paxter Redwine asked. Lord Tyrell will be at the High Tower. I think the High Tower, Ned said with a nod. Let's be about this. There are a lot of eyes on us. The dire wolf makes it obvious that you're here, Ned, Paxter said with a slight smile. Then the smile vanished. The blight is making a lot of people very worried. As it should, Ned sighed. Paxter nodded and then bellowed a string of nautical orders that made the ship heel slightly as it set a course right for the docks by the High Tower itself. You need not worry about Willis Tyrell, he's not his father, Paxter said as he looked at Ned again. He's young, but he's got a head on his shoulders. That said, his father could have hidden depths at times. Ned nodded. Aye, his father always made me wonder if he was a fool or not. The siege of Storm's End, the manner in which it was done, with no men being sent to help Rogar at the Trident, well, I wondered. Paxter tilted his head to one side. We all wondered, when word came of Yaris burning people in court for the slightest of reasons, and then your victory at the Stony Sept at Mace Tyrell went very quiet on everyone. There were rumors that orders had come from King's Landing to send men to aid Regé at the Trident, but if they were true or not, I could not say. I did hear the men mutter that he had become Lord Turtle, though. He had drawn his head and limbs in and was looking at Storm's End as if it was the only thing in the world. I don't know if he was undecided or just realized that staying before the walls of Storm's End and besieging it was the only thing to do, but... Well, I'll tell you this, in confidence, Ned. I was at sea, on patrol, the night that the Onion Knight sailed in to deliver his cargo, and when a seaman told me that he'd seen a sail by the shore slipping in between it and us, I told him that he was seeing things, that it was not but a shadow, and after we heard that Storm's End had been resupplied, Mace Tyrell didn't say a damn word to me in censure. When your banners were seen after King's Landing fell, I know that he looked as if he'd been reprieved from the gallows, which was all news to him, but Ned just nodded. A difficult man to understand. Paxter inclined his head, and then they both waited as the ship sailed on into the great harbor of Old Town, heading straight towards the vast bulk of the High Tower. As they approached the docks there, he could see men assembling by the wharf that they were headed for. With banners flying from standards, he could see the White Tower with red flames on a gray background of House High Tower, and of course the golden rose on a green field of House Tyrell. The ship slowed as the captain bellowed orders under the critical eye of Paxter Redwine, and as it approached the wharf, he looked at the party assembled there. Willis Tyrell was obviously the man standing at the head of the group, with a short spear of ancient appearance strapped to his back. Next to him stood Leighton Hightower, and behind them both was a young man who looked as if he'd lost quite a bit of weight, but who was still, well, pudgy. Familiar, too, it could only be Samwell Tarley. As the ship was moored, he placed a hand on Frostfire's head and looked at her. She was still staring at the High Tower itself and still tense and growling. You feel it too, don't you? She looked at him briefly, and he could see something in her eyes that made him sense that there was a very real danger there, and that something was coming. Danger, danger comes. Beware. By now the gangplank had been rigged and Ned walked to it, Frostfire behind him and then his guards. He strode down to the jetty briskly before striding over to the approaching welcome party. Lord Stark, let me be first to welcome you to the Reach, said Willis Tyrell, as he stepped forwards and held out a hand. I am Lord Tyrell. Thank you for your welcome. Ned replied as he shook hands with the Lord of the Reach. "I've answered your call for help." Willis Tyrell gestured to a servant, who stepped forwards with bread and salt, and Ned nodded and partook of the traditional gesture of hospitality. "Let me introduce you my grandfather, Lord Leighton Hightower, and also to Lord Samwell Tarly, heir to Hornhill, and the man who has done much to decipher the language of the runes on the gate under the High Tower." Leighton Hightower had a grip of iron and a look of utter determination on his face, and then he surprised Ned by saying in the language of the First Men, "Be welcome to the High Tower, Lord Stark of Winterfell. There is much to do." Ned blinked at that and then replied in the same language, "My thanks, Lord Hightower." The High Tower called, the North has answered, and then he turned to Samwell Tarly. "I met your father in the North, Lord Samwell. He was well, asked me to send his regards." An odd expression crossed the young lord's face, as if he was unsure what to say. "My thanks, Lord Stark," he said eventually, "and thank you for coming. As Lord of Winterfell, you're, well, the first of the First Men, and they were here long ago to build this." He looked at the bulk of the High Tower. "I, Bran the Builder, I've met his ghost." He looked at the incredulous looks of those in front of him, and then inclined his head. "And this is Frostfire, my dire wolf. I'd be obliged if word passes that she's not to be harmed in any way." There was a moment of quiet eyeing of the direwolf, but word had obviously passed of her coming, and Lord Tyrell nodded sharply. "Agreed, Lord Stark. Now, perhaps we should move to my grandfather's solar. There's much to talk about there. Normally, I would welcome you with a feast, but we need to be about this. What's behind that gate must be stopped. Lit on, Lord Taxel. We must indeed talk." The walk up to the solar was a long one, and Ned found himself a little achy in the legs by the time that he got there, but he was interested to see how easily Lord Takroll matched his stride. The tales were true, the man's leg was fully healed again, and he told the tale with little enough prompting from Ned, his voice shaking a little as he spoke of the brief glimpses he had been shown from the field of fire. Ned had countered it with the tale of what he had seen at Barrowtown, and as he spoke, he could see Samwell Tarly's eyes bulge a bit and then scribble notes in a book of foolscrap, as he somehow wrote and climbed the stairs at the same time. Lord Hightower had listened to the whole thing with a strange, abstracted look to his face that had almost made him look gaunt at times. And when they finally reached the solar, he saw at once that there was a woman there, daughter of Lord Hightower by the look of her. She curtsied at the sight of him, and then spoke the same greeting as Lord Hightower in the language of the First Men. "My daughter Melora," Lord Hightower said quietly. "She has been assisting in the consulting of these books on the history of the Hightower." Ned nodded, and then noted with dry amusement at the start she gave when she laid eyes on Frostfire. Or was it surprise or something else? He pulled the Fist of Winter out of his belt loop and placed it on a table to one side as he sat down. "The Fist of Winter?" Lord Tyrell said as he seated himself and placed the half-spear he had been holding to one side himself. "Aye, and this is Otherbane, a weapon of the First Men, like yours, and it helped me to save my father, at least for a while." And then he told the full tale, a tale every bit as unsettling as his own take of Barrowtown must have been to the Reachmen. The tale of the gate, with the face appearing in the stonework of the entrance, was chilling. "I know that the thing behind the gate is the drowned god," he said heavily after a long moment. "Have there been any further developments?" "The blight," said Willis Tyrell heavily. "It continues to spread. Old Town is a tinderbox, Lord Stark. One more spark will set it alight, such is the state of fear and dread. I take it that there have been no further attempts by the Starry Sept to cleanse the gate?" "No," said Lord Tyrell in a voice like iron. "And no such help, if it can be called that, would be accepted. The Septons have no idea what the gate is or how to deal with it. How could they? Some of them deny that the other gods even exist." Ned thought about what had happened over the past months. "Oh, they exist," he said dryly. "You can be very sure of that. You have heard about what happened at Pike, I take it." Lord Hightower asked in a low voice. "Word reached me. Fearful news. And word about Euron Greyjoy's ship. I know not what to say about anything about that. Madness." There was a long and bitter moment of silence, and then Lord Tyrell sighed. "Lord Stark, I am afraid that I must ask if you can go to the gate at once." Ned grasped the fist and stood up. "Aye, let's be about this, and—" But he never finished his words, because all of a sudden he felt a deep and terrible wrench in his chest and head, as if the world was spinning for a long moment. Frostfire stiffened as Whelan shook her head. And then Lord Hightower staggered as well. And then the entire Hightower seemed to shake and then chime, as if a bell somewhere deep inside it had been rung. It was a warning chime, not a celebration chime. He felt it all the way through him, as if something had rung within himself. "Grandfather, what's wrong?" Lord Tyrell asked wildly, coming to his feet as well, and grabbing other Bane. "Lord Stark?" "Something's terribly wrong," Lord Hightower said thickly. The Hightower itself cries out in warning. The chiming came again, and this time Willis Tyrell looked wildly about the room. "I felt that, as if it was below me, though." "The gate," Ned said through gritted teeth. "We must get there at once." "Father," the word came from Melora, who looked terrified all of a sudden, and Lord Hightower turned to her and smiled, a strained and terrible smile, before gesturing at her to stay. They took the stairs down 2 at a time, with Frostfire bounding grimly next to him. The feeling of terrible unease was still there, roiling through him, and he could feel the Hightower still shivering as if it was a fearful beast. "I think," he panted, "that Bran the Builder did indeed build a part of this place. I feel it." "You feel the Hightower?" Samwell Tarly puffed, looking as if he was surprised at being able to keep pace with Ned's long legs. "I feel it," Ned admitted, looking at the walls. He felt, no, that something was trying to warn him that something terrible was coming, or was perhaps already here. Was the drowned god suddenly trying to escape? Was it some new devilry by the others? Or was it Euron Greyjoy? As they reached the level of the main hall, he could hear the cries of alarm from the garrison and servants of the Hightower, who could obviously feel that something was going on, and it was only Lord Hightower's roars to keep the way ahead clear, that stopped a panic-stricken mob from forming. Down they went again, down yet more endless stairs, and then Ned made himself pause and take smaller strides as the stone steps beneath his feet changed to a black stone of smaller size. He knew then that they were approaching the lower part of the Hightower. There were guards there at the lower hall, and the corridor that was there, men who had a look of panic in their eyes. But they were still true to their guard posts, and only stood aside as they approached, their eyes on Ned and Frostfire. He could see relief in those eyes. Hope that he could do something, and he prayed to the old gods that he wouldn't let them down. Too much depended on this. As they strode quickly down the corridor to a large set of doors, and the sweaty-faced men that guarded them, Lord Tyrell barked out orders to open them. They rushed to do so, and as they opened, Ned would see a strange and terrible green light in the room that lay on the other side. "By the old gods and the new," Lord Tyrell muttered, "the gate." As they entered, he could see the gate for the first time. It was just as had been described in the letters, but it was glowing, shining with a green, glowing light that spoke of rot and decay. He could almost see faint green flames coming from the gate posts and the lintel, but there was no heat whatsoever. The flames were sickly and cold. It was like nothing he had ever seen before in his life, and his heart almost stopped in his chest for a moment as he beheld it. This was a danger of an unknown kind, but something that he had to confront. He hefted the fist of winter in one hand and then placed a hand on the neck of Frostfire, who was at his side, growling in defiance of the dreadful thing in the room. "Gods," he said thickly. "Where do I start with that?" There was no warning whatsoever, just a sudden and terrible stench of stagnant water that had something rotting in it. And then there was a strange sound as a black-cloaked and one-eyed man emerged out of a cloud of stinking black air next to him. "You die," the man rasped as a knife flashed through the air, and Ned had just enough time to twist slightly to avoid the worst of the blow. But not enough to avoid it completely, and agony flared at his side as the blade bit deep. "You die, Stark," and then a fist met his head, and he knew no more. Samwell, he had to admit that he disliked the gate under the Hightower. There was something about it that just made him want to walk away from the damn thing. The moment he laid eyes on it again. He knew what it was now, he knew what was behind it. But he still hated the fact that the moment he approached it, he felt the kind of fear that would make even Father piss himself. Which was something that always made him pause. Bravery, could it only be shown on the battlefield, as Father said, or were there other ways of measuring it? It was hard to tell these days. At least in these past months, he'd been finally free of Father's endless bloody moans about how fat he was, how unmartial. Not a warrior too fond of books. Finding other Bane had shut him up, and researching the gate and the language of the Children of the Forest had gained him the respect of Lords Tyrell and Hightower. So Father could bugger off if he came back from the wall and started to drop unsubtle hints about joining the Night's Watch. All of which was a welcome distraction. As they hurried down the stairs towards the sodding gate, he could tell that Lord Stark was worried, that Lord Hightower was frantic, and that, worryingly enough, Lord Tyrell was holding Other Bane in one hand as they hurtled down the stairs. But then even he could tell that something was horribly, horribly wrong. He could feel something in the air, something in his feet about the way that the Hightower was reacting. That made no bloody sense whatsoever. How could a building react? But then Bran the Builder was supposed to have built at least part of the Hightower. A Stark had had a hand in it. The same Stark who had built Storm's End and Winterfell and the Wall, who had probably known that the others would return someday, who had probably used magic regularly. The Starks had to be linked to the Hightower. Lord Stark's reaction and that of his direwolf was therefore understandable. It was a natural conclusion that he couldn't say, because he was running too hard by now. As they reached the doors to the room with the gate, he gasped. Gods, the gate was horribly different, and he could see flames. The hammering had at least stopped, and he wondered why, as he heard Lord Stark mutter about how he could start with the gate. And then a cloud of black and stinking air seemed to appear to one side of Lord Stark, and a black-cloaked man emerged from it, holding a knife. You die, he snarled. You die, Stark. And then he stabbed at Lord Stark, who twisted somehow just before the blow fell, but who was still hit by it, along with the punch to the head that the man added. No! Lord Tyrell bellowed, and then everything went sideways, as the Lord of the Reach pulled Otterbane free of its holder and hefted it in his hand. The black-clad stranger whirled to face him with a snarl. He had dark hair, a patch over one eye, blue lips for some reason, and there was something odd about his face that made Sam instantly uneasy. And then the man pulled a black blade made of shadow out of nothing and swung it at Lord Tyrell, who countered it with Otterbane, and then there was a flash of bright light and black shadow, and Sam found himself flying backwards, hitting the floor on his back with a thud that made his head swim. He shook his head, desperate to stop the room from swimming, to get back on his feet. What in the name of all the gods was going on? He flipped himself over and levered himself up. What he saw made his mouth drop open in horror. The stranger was standing to one side, hunched over and groaning, shaking his head as if to clear it. Lord Tyrell was prone on the floor, also groaning. Otterbane not far from him. Lord Hightower was also on his back, not too far from Lord Stark, who seemed to have been flipped over by the flash of whatever the hells that had been. And here was where it all got strange. Because his giant direwolf was standing by the prone Lord of the North, and her eyes were filled with burning red fire as she growled and snarled at the stranger. And to make everything even worse, the doorway from the room was filled with some kind of black-tinted fire, stopping the horrified guards beyond it from entering, and the gate was shaking again, as something howled on the other side, a howl that made every hair on the back of his neck stand on end in sheer terror. Filthy, fucking, stinking Hightowers! The stranger finally screamed as he scrubbed at his forehead for a long moment. And Starks? Scum and vermin, Tyrells too, and gardeners. Heck. But I made it. I'm in. So much for your wards. So much for your spells. I am Euron fucking Greyjoy, and I spit on your wards. Getting through was painful, but I'm here. I'm here. He turned and faced the gate. I'm here. The gate shuddered again, and dust cascaded down from the ceiling. Sam stared at it in horror, and then looked around quickly. Lord Stark looked as if he was dying, his chest barely rising and falling. Lord Hightower was trying to pull himself up, and Lord Tyrell was also groaning and trying to sit up. It was up to him. Oh gods! Sam stood with a shiver and a shudder, and then scrabbled over to grab Otterbane, and then he stood and shambled over, chest heaving, to face the mad Greyjoy as he cackled in front of the gate, waving that unsettling and bizarre sword in the air. It was the hardest thing he'd ever done in his life, and he issued a silent prayer to the old gods who had tossed the drowned god through this bloody thing, and asked for their help from this madman. For a long moment, Euron Greyjoy didn't seem to even notice him, so caught up was he in his cackling madness, and then he blinked and frowned at him. You boy, get out of my way. I have a destiny to fulfill. I will become a god here today. No, you will not, he said, trying to stop his teeth from chattering with terror. I am Samwell Bloody Tarley, and I'll fight you if I have to. You'll not get past me. This seemed to amuse the Ironborn madman. immensely, because he laughed and laughed, and as he did, Sam stared at him. There was something strange about the man's face, as if the skin was too loose in places. The one eye he could see was almost bulging in its socket, and the cheekbones looked a bit odd. "You?" Greyjoy finally said. "You're Randall Tarley's whelp. I heard his hair was fat as butter and a craven. Is it you? There's more meat on you than there should be. Surely." The cackling came again, and then stopped. "Go away, boy." "No." He hefted Otherbane again, and then noted how the lunatic blinked and looked warily at it. "Oh, are you afraid of this, Otherbane?" "I fear nothing, boy," Greyjoy snarled. "And I have won. Stark's dying or dead, Shirell's over there. You are in my way, and I will achieve my destiny. I will kill the drowned god, and I will absorb his power. I will wax, and others will wane, and I will be a god." The noise from the gate stopped suddenly, and Sam knew in his heart that whatever the thing was that remained on the other side of the gate, it was terrified. And then there was a sound like something like a keen or a wail or a shriek from Otherbane. It shook in his hands as if it was alive, and Sam blinked as it seemed to glow with red light. Euron Greyjoy seemed to flinch slightly, and then he looked about the room wildly before staring at Frostfire as if he had only just noticed her. "You," he shrieked the word. "How did you—" "No, no, no. Stark's dead. I killed him." Frostfire howled at the Ironborn madman, and Sam would see that the eyes of the Lord of the North were barely open, but totally white. "Greyjoy!" Sam said thickly as the black-clad took a step towards the prone lord and the direwolf. "Greyjoy!" Euron Greyjoy whirled on him, and he swallowed and clenched Otherbane in both hands. "Fight me." They were words that almost made him want to piss himself, but he meant it. "Fight me." There was a long and singing moment of silence as the mad Ironborn seemed to debate what to do in his head, and then he raised the black shadow sword in his one hand and strode towards Sam. "Fuck," he thought, in desperation. "I'm going to bloody die, but I'll die like a Tarly," and he hefted Otherbane and prepared to meet that blow from Euron Greyjoy with all he had, and then everything went sideways again. Something shook the room with a massive thud. Something froze him in place. Euron Greyjoy, too. The latter trying to look in all directions with his one eyeball. "Thank you, Sam." The speaker was Lord Leighton Hightower. He was upright again, and red and green fire burned in his eyes. "You'll never be forgotten for your bravery. Give me Otherbane now." The Lord of the Hightower gestured, and then Otherbane was ripped out of his hands and flew through the air towards Lord Hightower. As it smacked into his hands, he strode, shakily, towards Ned Stark. Euron Greyjoy groaned and then shook in place as he seemed to try and break free of whatever had been done to him. But it was too late. Sam knew it, as Lord Hightower placed Otherbane gently onto the chest of the Lord of the North. "Old gods!" Lord Hightower shouted, and the room seemed to shrink for a long moment, as everyone, including the now crouching Lord Tyrell, whose eyes were widening as he realized what was going on, looked at him. "Old gods." He looked at the gate and then at the mad Ironborn, and then at the direwolf. "A life for a life," and then he placed a hand on the head of Frostfire. Red light exploded into the room, red light that came from the hand of Lord Hightower, tinged with green. The direwolf froze in place, and then howled again. "No!" Euron Greyjoy finally bellowed. "No!" But it was too late. Ned Stark suddenly sat upright, his face smeared in blood, his hand grasping for and finding the Fist of Winter. And then, as Lord Hightower slumped bonelessly down, Lord Stark stood up and hefted the Fist of Winter. Then, until his dying day, he never understood just what it had been that tugged him sideways. He remembered a vague feeling of dizziness, of touching Frostfire's side as he fell, as the darkness took him, and then it was as if he had jumped sideways. Perspective flickered, he was suddenly a slightly different height, and he had too many legs. But he couldn't move. It was as if he knew that he shouldn't move as well. He had to be by himself? He could sense that he was dying, or rather his body was getting weaker and weaker. What had the man who had attacked him had on that blade? It was then that he caught sight of the man, and he suddenly really couldn't move, because there was something else there, inside that man. He could sense it, smell it, see it. There was a blackness about him, like an aura or a shadow. Evil. He was seeing a man who was drenched with evil. And then the man identified himself as Euron Greyjoy, in a cackling rant that made his fur raise with fury and horror. This was the Kinslayer Greyjoy, The man who had murdered his own crew to create something beyond horror. The gate was making horrible noises, some too high-pitched to almost hear. There was something on the other side of it that was terrified. And then he watched as Samwell Tarly confronted Greyjoy. He could tell that the lad was terrified. He could see it in his face, but he still did it anyway. He stood in front of the gate, other bane in hand, and he stopped the man in his tracks. Because Ned could tell that he was afraid of other bane. And then something ran through him. The knowledge? No. The absolute certainty that the old gods were here, in this room, at this time. He could feel it. The room seemed to shake, and then he felt something else wax in the room. Someone was performing magic. An old and deep magic that came from the heart. It was Lysson Hightower. He could feel it in the air, and he wondered at how he could do so, if this was how Frostfire could normally see the world, sense the magic, be aware of such threats. He could sense the moment that Euron Greyjoy seemed to notice him again. That unsettling eye looked at him as the Ironborn Kinslayer ranted at him, and then Otterbane was almost ripped out of young Sam's hands and flew towards Lord Hightower, who took it and then placed it onto the chest of the body to one side that was his real body. Was he dead? Old gods! Hightower cried, and Ned felt his body, both bodies, quiver. Old gods! A life for a life. Red fire exploded everywhere, and as Lysson Hightower placed a hand on his head, he felt himself suddenly fall through a sudden and unimaginable distance. Suddenly there was a need to breath, to take a gulp of air into his lungs, and he sat up, other bang clattering on the floor to one side as he clenched his hand around the fist of winter. Strength suddenly flowed through him, the pain at his side receding and then vanishing completely. He stood and flexed his muscles, and glared at Greyjoy. His mouth was dry. He could feel dried blood on his forehead, and he was angry. Very fucking angry. And by the way that Greyjoy paled, even further, he could tell that the bastard was afraid. "Euron Greyjoy," he said through a dry mouth, "it's past time for you to die." Samwell Tarly had run to Lord Hightower's body and was shaking his head over it, and Greyjoy stepped back before casting a quick look at the gate behind him. Frostfire was growling ferociously at him, and at a gesture from Ned started to pace off to one side, flanking him. The Ironborn bared his teeth as he hefted the black and cursed blade in his hand, and then he squinted and pulled a face as he pulled another one out of the air into his free hand. "I think not, Stark," Greyjoy growled through lips that seemed wrong somehow. "I have a destiny to fulfill. I will be a god." "No, you're destined to die and become a corpse," Ned replied, and then quickly bent down and picked up other bane in his own free hand. He could feel the weapon warm slightly to his touch, and then, to his surprise, the head of the spear lightened and then erupted into red flame that let off no heat. Winterfell! He lunged with the fist, and Greyjoy parried the blow with a grimace, dark sparks sparking off the black blade, before ducking under Ned's second lunge with other bane, and then making Frostfire dart back just before she could hamstring him. "Damn you!" Greyjoy howled, taking another glance back at the gate. His face looked wrong. The skin slack again. There was something dark under his one eye. "Ned!" The word came from Willis Tyrell, who was at last upright and off to one side, looking angry and pugilistic. "Throw me other bane." Ned smiled a savage grin and then tossed the weapon to the younger man, who hefted it with a smile as his face was lit up with the red flames from the tip of the spear. "Grandfather died to stop you. You son of a whore, Euron Greyjoy, and we will end you." Greyjoy licked what seemed to be very slack and dry lips, with a gray-purple tongue that again looked wrong, and then Ned swung the fist. Greyjoy parried in a shower of black sparks. The other black sword came around, but then met other bane as well as Tyrell, attacked on the other side. More black sparks and something in the room seemed to squeal and gibber as Greyjoy danced backwards, his chest heaving from the effort of the fight. Ned took a step forwards. He was tired, but this was a fight for his life, and the lives of so many others, and he lashed forwards again, joined by Willis in another dual attack that had Greyjoy again pushed back, black sparks showering onto the floor from the parries that he was delivering with those black blades made of something evil. And then he attacked, slashing against the pair of them, forcing to step backwards themselves as they parried his assault. More black sparks. What were his blades made of? But he had pushed too far. Frostfire went in low as he passed her, those great jaws flashing out, and then suddenly Greyjoy screamed as the direwolf ripped out a part of the back of his leg, She darted back quickly, shaking her head and spitting out what she had savaged from him, and Ned could see that the flesh she was almost retching on was red and black. Greyjoy went down on one knee for a moment and then staggered upwards before the fist hammered into his shoulder and something crunched, making him scream again. As he staggered back, almost hopping on his good leg, his lips peeled back and his teeth seemed pointed almost as he snarled at them all. And then he dropped to one knee and thrust the swords into the floor in front of him. Ned blinked, and then a crack of lightning seemed to boom from the swords and something seemed to flash from them. Ned didn't even hesitate. He darted forwards and somehow parried the flash with the fist, directing it away from them and somehow into the far wall, which was scorched from the blow. The impact almost drove Ned to his knees, but then he came fully upright again. "You die now, Greyjoy." The Ironborn bared his teeth again, looked at the approaching Willis Tyrell, glanced at the snarling Frostfire, shot another desperate look at the gate, and then he screamed in pain and frustration. "I will kill you all," and then he raised a hand and conjured a portal of black and stinking air before passing into it slowly. Ned started forwards, meaning to kill the wretched man, but then the room shook again, and Greyjoy screamed again in agony. His face was distorted as he passed into the portal, horribly so, and Ned paled as he saw it ripple in a way that nothing human ever should. Words, but oh wait, stronger. Another scream rent the air, and suddenly he was gone, leaving his robes, which slithered wetly to the ground with an unpleasant noise. Ned stood there panting for a long moment, and then he looked at Willis Tyrell, who looked as exhausted as he felt. The black fire at the door to the high tower was gone, and the guards who had been on the other side took hesitant steps into the chamber, their eyes wide as they looked at him and the others. "Be careful," Ned panted as he looked about warily. He came from nowhere, although I think that getting here hurt him. "Getting out too," Willis said. "Left his robes." "Not just robes," Sam Tarley said, and there was horror in his voice. "That's his skin." Ned frowned and then walked over to it, and then he paled. Yes. Euron Greyjoy's skin was puddled on the flagstones, turning gray and then blackening as it seemed to sizzle in the air. "He must be dead," Willis muttered as young Tarley threw up to one side. "Who could survive that?" "Someone no longer human," Ned replied. "He's beyond wrong. Evil. Mad." And then the gate shook again and then flared with a terrible, unnatural light as it pulsed. The drowned god was coming through.